They pushed her off a stage in front of an entire hall of nobles, and the room laughed. Not gasped. Not went silent. Laughed. Because that's what you do when the lowest-ranking servant in Summit Forge Pack stumbles. You laugh, you look away, and you forget her name by morning. That was the plan. That was always the plan. Except she never hit the floor. One hand caught her. One hand, no effort, as if gravity itself had been overruled. And when the man holding her wrist straightened up and the candlelight found his face, the laughter didn't fade, it stopped, like someone had cut the sound entirely. Council leader Marcus Hale went white. Gage Thorne, watching from the gallery, went very still. And Luna Tessa Noir, the most powerful woman in that building, the woman who had spent 3 years making sure Sienna Blaze knew exactly how small she was, looked at a servant girl for the first time with something that wasn't contempt. It was fear. 3 years of silence. 3 years of cold floors and lowered eyes, and a sealed letter she was too afraid to open. This is the night it all ends and begins. Stories like this one take real time to build. If that kind of work means something to you, you probably already know what to do. Act 1. The Busreed Girl. The water was always cold by the time Sienna reached it. That was the particular arithmetic of being last to the basin, last to the bread, last to everything that might still hold some warmth. She had stopped minding the cold water the way she had stopped minding a lot of things. You either made peace with the small indignities or you spent 3 years drowning in them, and Sienna had chosen, very deliberately, to survive. She dressed in the dark because the single candle in her room was rationed and morning was not the time to spend it. Her hands found the buttons by memory, rough cloth, practical cut, the kind of clothes designed to disappear into the background of a grand estate. Which was precisely the point. Summit Forge Pack's main house was the kind of building that reminded you of your place without ever needing to say it aloud. Marble floors that cost more than a village earned in a year. Ceilings so high the candlelight never quite reached them. Corridors lined with portraits of pack founders, all of them looking down with the specific expression of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged exactly where they stood. Sienna had learned the corridors the way you learn a foreign language when your life depends on fluency. The East Wing by 5 in the morning, before the ranked members began their day. The kitchens through the back passage, never the main hall. The grand staircase was not hers to use. The smaller one, behind the linen room, the one that smelled permanently of damp stone, that one was hers. She had mapped the entire estate in invisible lines. Here you may go, here you may not, here you become invisible, here you cease to exist entirely. It was a Tuesday when she first arrived, 3 years ago, with nothing but a travel bag and a coat she never took off indoors. A mid-rank wolf named Carver had processed her intake paperwork without looking up once, classified her Omega based on the absence of any documented bloodline, and assigned her a room on the lowest floor. The room had one window that faced a wall. She had told herself it was temporary. She had told herself a lot of things in the beginning. By 6, she was on her knees in the east corridor with a scrubbing brush and a bucket of water that had already gone gray. 2 ranked wolves passed her without adjusting their path, one of them stepping close enough that the hem of his jacket brushed her shoulder. He didn't look down. She had stopped expecting him to. This was just the texture of the days now, the way you learned to fold yourself small enough that the world could move around you without friction, without acknowledgement, without the minor inconvenience of having to register that you were a person. She was good at it. That was the thing that kept her sane and broke her heart in equal measure. She was very, very good at disappearing. Luna Tessa Noir arrived in the east corridor at 8:30, which was earlier than usual, which meant something had put her in a particular mood. Sienna knew her schedule the way prey learns a predator's patterns, not out of fascination, but out of the fundamental necessity of not being in the wrong place. She was already in the wrong place. Tessa was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, deliberately, precisely, with no detail left unconsidered. Dark hair always perfectly set. Clothes that fit like they had been made that morning specifically for her body, because they had been. She moved through Summit Forge as if the estate itself was grateful for her presence, and the estate, to its credit, behaved accordingly. Wolves stepped aside. Conversations lowered. Rooms seemed to rearrange their light. She was not simply cruel. That distinction mattered. Simple cruelty was loud, uncontrolled, the kind that left evidence. Tessa's cruelty was architectural. It was load-bearing. It held things in place. She paused beside Sienna without breaking stride, just a slight slowing, a half-second reorientation, the way a hawk tilts its wing. In her hand was the morning tea she had not yet finished. She looked at the section of floor Sienna had just scrubbed, wet and gleaming and smelling of lye. Then she tipped the cup. The tea spread dark across the marble. Sienna watched it reach the grout lines. Tessa walked on. She didn't speak. She didn't look back. The two wolves crossing the far end of the corridor saw it and looked away immediately, with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned that witnessing things had consequences. Sienna stayed on her knees. She dipped the brush back in the bucket. She started again. That was the mechanism of it. Not a scene, not a confrontation, nothing you could point to and name as an event. Just a cup of tea, tipped by a steady hand, on a floor that was going to need cleaning anyway. The message delivered so cleanly it left no mark on anything on anyone. Except Sienna. And Sienna had learned not to let marks show. Luca found her at noon, which was when he usually found her, with a piece of bread he had absolutely not taken from the ranked members' lunch table and would absolutely deny if asked. He set it beside her without ceremony and lowered himself to sit on the bottom step of the small staircase while she ate. Luca Everett was not heroic. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself, because she had made the mistake in the early months of needing him to be, and that had not been fair to either of them. He was a mid-rank pack member with an inconveniently large conscience, a talent for going unnoticed that almost matched her own, and no particular ambition beyond getting through the day without doing something he'd regret. He was not going to save her. He was not built for saving people. But he had used her full name on the third day, when everyone else was still calling her you or the new Omega or nothing at all, and something about that small precision had lodged in her chest like a splinter she had no desire to remove. "Tessa's visiting family this weekend," he said, tearing off a piece of his own bread. "Which means the East Wing will be manageable Friday afternoon, if you want to avoid Dax's patrol route." Dax Rourke, Summit Forge's pack enforcer, was a different category of problem, not subtle like Tessa, just large and unpleasant and possessed of a very specific disdain for anyone below his rank, which was nearly everyone. Luca tracked his schedule the way you tracked weather systems. Preventatively. "Noted," Sienna said. He looked at her for a moment. "You're quiet today." "I'm quiet every day." "You're quiet differently today." She didn't answer, because he was right, and she didn't feel like explaining that the tea on the floor incident had settled into her somewhere it wasn't supposed to, in a place she usually kept successfully sealed off. She chewed the bread and looked at the wall and breathed through it until it passed. Luca didn't push. That was the other thing about him. He had learned, somewhere along the way, that some silences were not puzzles to be solved, but whether to be sat through. He stayed until she was done eating, then stood, brushed the crumbs off his jacket, and said, "Founder's ceremony prep starts tomorrow. It's going to be a difficult week." She nodded. He left. She went back to work. At night, alone in her room with the candle finally lit, Sienna took off her coat. She always did this slowly. Not because the coat was delicate, it was worn at both elbows and the lining had frayed along the left seam, but because of what the lining held. She could feel it without looking, a slight stiffness in the fabric, the faint crinkle of paper sealed inside. 3 years of knowing it was there and never opening it. She turned the coat over in her hands, ran her thumb along the seam the way she had done 100 nights before this one. Her grandmother had pressed it into her hands 2 weeks before she died, when breathing had already become an effort and words had to be chosen carefully because there weren't many left. "Don't open it until the time is right," she had said. "You'll know." And then, quieter, like something she was saying to herself as much as to Sienna, "It will protect you. But only if you're ready for what it means." Sienna had been 17 and terrified, and she had nodded and tucked the letter into the coat lining herself, and she had been waiting ever since to feel ready. She was 20 now. She was still waiting. She hung the coat back on the hook. The candle threw its shadow long and crooked across the wall. She lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and told herself, as she told herself every night, that tomorrow she would think about opening it. That tomorrow she would decide. That the time would come and she would know it when it did. She fell asleep before the candle burned out. The coat hung in the dark. The letter stayed sealed. The announcement came the next morning in the main hall, while the ranked members gathered for the day's briefing and Sienna moved along the edges with a tray of empty glasses. Tessa stood at the front of the room, composed and unhurried, the way she was when she had already decided how something would go. "The ceremonial reading at this year's Founders' Ceremony," Tessa said, her voice carrying easily across the hall, "will be performed by one of our own." A pause, the kind that was not uncertainty but theater. "Sienna." "The Omega from the East Wing service rotation." The silence lasted about 1 second before the room found its reaction. It was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was the sound of a joke landing, suppressed smiles, exchanged glances, one wolf near the back who didn't bother suppressing anything and simply looked amused. The ceremonial reading was an honor. A tradition. It had been performed by pack elders, high-ranked wolves, founding family members. The idea of the floor-scrubbing Omega standing at the founder's podium was, apparently, the funniest thing that had happened all week. Sienna kept her face completely still. She had practiced at that. She looked at a fixed point on the wall above Tessa's head, and she breathed evenly, and she did not let a single thing she was feeling reach the surface. Across the room, she caught Luca's face by accident. He was not smiling. He had gone the particular color of someone who has just understood something the rest of the room hasn't, and the look he was giving her was not pity. It was something closer to alarm. Tessa's eyes found hers for just a moment. The expression there was familiar by now, not cruel exactly. Precise. Like a woman completing a calculation she had started some time ago, and finding that the numbers still came out the way she intended. Sienna looked back at the fixed point on the wall. She nodded once to show she had heard. She picked up the tray and walked back through the door she was allowed to use. Act 2. The Fall. The Founders' Hall had been built to make people feel small, and it was very good at its job. 3 stories of dark timber and dressed stone, the ceiling lost somewhere above the reach of the candelabras that lined every wall in iron brackets, each one burning with a dozen flames. The long tables had been cleared and replaced with tiered seating for dignitaries, the floor opened for standing guests, the gallery above filling steadily with overflow nobles who had traveled from territories most Summit Forge wolves couldn't place on a map. The Founders' Ceremony happened once a year and mattered, in the way that things matter when enough powerful people agree that they do. Tonight the hall smelled of beeswax and expensive wool and the particular tension of a room full of ranked wolves all quietly measuring one another. Council leader Marcus Hale stood near the ceremonial podium in a coat with more buttons than it needed, presiding over the pre-ceremony gathering with the expression of a man who understood his own importance and was never more than 3 seconds from reminding someone of it. He moved through the room in slow, deliberate arcs, pausing to receive the greetings of visiting dignitaries with the practiced warmth of someone who had been performing warmth for so long it had worn grooves in his face. Behind him, 2 pack elders waited with scrolls they would never actually need to consult. Up in the gallery, 1 level above the main floor and positioned at the rail with the stillness of a man who had arrived early specifically to watch the room fill, was Gage Thorne. He was not from Summit Forge. His territory bordered it to the northeast, and he had attended this ceremony 3 years, running with the particular interest of a neighbor who was thinking about renovation. He held a glass he wasn't drinking from, and he watched the floor below with the kind of attention that didn't look like attention unless you knew what you were looking for. Sienna knew what she was looking for. She had spent 3 years learning to read rooms. She stood in the service corridor beside the stage entrance, dressed in the cleanest version of her work clothes, which was still unmistakably what it was. No one had offered her anything else to wear. That, too, was part of it. She could see a narrow slice of the hall through the gap in the curtain, the candlelight, the ranked wolves finding their seats, the low current of conversation that filled a space like water before anything official began. She watched Dax Rourke take his position near the stage steps, arms folded, the particular looseness in his shoulders of someone anticipating something they find amusing. She breathed. She thought about her grandmother's voice. She had been doing that for 3 days, reaching for it like a handhold. The ceremony began with the traditional address from Marcus Hale, which was long and self-congratulatory in the way of things that don't need to be either. The elders read the land holdings. The alpha of Summit Forge, a broad, unreadable man named Calamvos, sat at the head table and said very little. Tessa sat at his right, dressed in something dark and precise, her face arranged in the expression she wore for public occasions, gracious, attentive, faintly luminous. Performing goodness so fluently you had to know her well to see the architecture underneath. And then Marcus Hale announced the ceremonial reading and said Sienna's name, and the room did what the room had been quietly waiting to do since the announcement 3 days ago. It smiled. She walked up the stage steps with her chin level and her hands loose at her sides. The founding text was already open on the podium, marked at the correct passage. She had read it 4 times in preparation, in the small hours of the morning, by candlelight, mouthing the words until they stopped feeling foreign. But standing here now, with 200 wolves watching and the silence shaped specifically around the joke of her presence, she looked down at the first line and felt something unexpected move through her. Familiarity. Not recognition of having practiced it. Something older than that, deeper, the words settling into her mouth the way things do when they were somehow always supposed to be there. The Ashveil Founding Covenant. She hadn't known that's what it was called. She knew only that the cadence of it felt like something her grandmother had read to her once, long ago, in a different life. She began to read. Her voice came out clear. Not loud, not performing, just clear, with a steadiness that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with 3 years of learning to hold herself still under pressure. The words moved through the hall and the hall received them, and for a moment the ambient smiling softened into something that wasn't quite sure of itself anymore. A few wolves near the front shifted in their seats. The conversation at the edges of the room dimmed. Sienna read on. The covenant spoke of bloodlines and founding bonds, of the territories held in trust, of the promise made between the first pack leaders that the land would remember who had shaped it. Ancient language, formal and heavy, but she carried it without stumbling, without hesitation, each phrase landing with a precision that had no business coming from a girl in service clothes who mopped floors for a living. In the front row, a visiting elder leaned slightly toward his companion and said something low. His companion nodded, watching the stage. Tessa was watching too. Sienna could feel it, that fixed, calculating attention, without looking up from the page. She kept reading. She was halfway through the second passage when she felt the shift in the room more than heard it. The quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of condescension. It was the silence of people who had expected one thing and were quietly getting another, and hadn't yet decided what to do with that. She kept her eyes on the text. She did not let herself feel anything about it yet. Then Tessa moved her gaze to the left. Just slightly. And Dax Rourke unfolded his arms. It happened fast, the way things do when they've been decided in advance. Dax stepped forward, placed one hand on the side of the stage platform, and shoved. Not Sienna, the platform itself, The cheap removable kind used for lower ceremony events, the kind that was never meant to bear much weight or withstand much force. It lurched sideways. Sienna's foot hit the edge of nothing, and she went over. The room made a sound. Not alarm. Laughter, already forming, already rising, the release of 200 people who had been waiting for the punchline to land. It didn't land. A hand caught her wrist. One hand, wrapped around the bone with a grip that was absolutely effortless, stopping her fall so completely that for one disoriented moment Sienna thought she had imagined falling at all. She was suspended at an angle, the floor a foot below her, not moving. The hand was not straining. The arm attached to it showed no effort whatsoever. Then she was upright, set back on her feet with a steadiness that asked nothing of her. The laughter stopped. Not faded. Stopped cut, as if someone had simply removed the sound from the room and not replaced it with anything. The silence that followed was the most complete thing Sienna had ever stood inside. She turned. The man behind her was standing in the space reserved for unannounced guests against the back wall of the hall, in a position that meant he had been there long enough to watch everything that had just happened. He was not in ceremony dress. He wasn't dressed for an audience at all, which, in a room full of wolves performing their finest versions of themselves, made him the only person present who didn't need to. He straightened fully now, and the nearest candelabra found the lines of his face, and Sienna watched the room discover who he was in real time. It moved in waves. The servants near the back first, a tray hitting the floor somewhere to the left, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the depth of the silence. Then the ranked wolves in the seated section, heads turning, the particular stillness that falls over powerful people when they encounter something more powerful. Marcus Hale's face, when the recognition reached it, went from pink to the specific white of a man rapidly recalculating everything he had just presided over. His hands found the edge of the podium. In the gallery, Gage Thorne set down his glass very carefully and became a man made of complete stillness. And Tessa. Sienna didn't have to look for long. Tessa was already looking at her, not at Reed, not at the room, at Sienna specifically, and the expression on her face was one Sienna had never seen there before. Not in 3 years. Not once. The architecture of composure was still in place, every feature arranged correctly, but underneath it, visible only because Sienna had spent 3 years learning the exact topography of that face, fear. Clean, certain, unwelcome fear. Reed Wilder, alpha of the Ashveil coalition, did not speak. He looked at Sienna, and the look contained several things at once, a recognition that had nothing to do with having met her before, a fury at what he had just watched happen that was enormous and absolutely controlled, and beneath both of those, something that had no name yet, something older and more fundamental, the kind of thing that arrives not as a thought, but as a fact you suddenly find yourself already knowing. He did not release her wrist immediately. He held it for one more second, as if putting her down was a decision that required something from him. Then he did. And the room remained exactly as silent as it had been, because the silence now belonged to something much larger than the moment that had caused it. Act 3. The Scent and the Secret. The hall found its voice again slowly, the way a room does when it isn't sure what just happened and needs to decide collectively how to feel about it. Conversation returned in fragments, low, careful, nothing like the easy noise of before. Wolves who had been smiling 30 seconds ago were now studying their hands or finding something urgent to discuss with the person beside them. The joke had not landed. Something else had, and no one was yet sure of its weight. Sienna was still standing where Reed had set her, at the edge of where the stage had been, the founding text somewhere on the floor behind her. She was aware of the room in the way she was always aware of rooms, peripherally, completely, every exit mapped automatically. She was also aware that the man beside her had not moved, and that his stillness was a different quality from everyone else's. The room was still because it was unsettled. He was still because he had decided to be. She turned to face him because not turning would have been its own statement. Up close, the controlled fury she had read from across the room was more precise than she'd expected. It wasn't hot. It was the kind of anger that had already been processed into something quieter and therefore more dangerous, sitting behind his eyes like a door that was not currently open but could be. He was looking at her with an attention that had nothing performative in it, no display, no posturing. Just looking, the way you look at something you've been trying to find for a long time and have just located in the last place you thought to check. Your name, he said. Not a demand. Almost conversational, but with an undertow. Sienna. She kept her voice even. Sienna Blaze. Something moved across his face. He repeated it, not aloud, just the shape of it, her name in his mouth like he was confirming something against a list he'd been carrying for a while. His jaw tightened once, briefly, and then he said, "How long have you been here?" 3 years. He absorbed that. Whatever the answer did to him, he did not let it reach the surface fully. And before that? She had a practiced answer for this question. She had given it many times in the early months, when people still occasionally asked. But standing here, with this particular person asking it, the practiced answer felt suddenly inadequate in a way she couldn't account for. She opened her mouth, and he saw her hesitate, and something in his expression shifted, not impatience, closer to recognition. As if her hesitation confirmed something he already suspected. "You don't have to answer that tonight," he said. That was not what she had expected him to say. The moment stretched one beat too long for safety, and Sienna felt the room's attention on them, subtle, sideways, but present. She could see Marcus Hale in her peripheral vision performing intense interest in a conversation that wasn't holding his focus. She could feel Tessa somewhere behind her like a cold pressure at the back of her neck. "I need to return to my duties," she said, which was not exactly a lie and not exactly the truth. He didn't move to stop her. He simply held her gaze for one more second, and what was in his eyes in that second was something she was going to have to think about later, when she was somewhere small and quiet and could afford to feel things. Then he nodded, once, and she turned and walked to the service entrance and through it, and did not let herself run until the door had closed behind her. Luca was in the corridor. He had clearly been waiting. He was standing with his back against the wall, and the specific tension of someone who has been standing that way for longer than was comfortable. And when she came through the door, he pushed off immediately and crossed to her in 3 steps. He grabbed her arm. She had never seen him do that before. "Sienna." His voice was low and stripped of its usual careful steadiness. "Open the letter. Tonight. You have to open the letter tonight." She looked at his face and understood this was not an opinion. "What did you see?" "I saw him catch you." He shook his head, pressing past that part. "That's not, listen to me. I saw Tessa's face. Right after. Not the public face, the real one, the one underneath." He paused, organizing it. "I have watched that woman for 2 years, and I have never seen her afraid of anything." She was afraid, Sienna. Not of him. Of you. Whatever is in that letter, she knows something about it, and the moment Reed Wilder caught you in front of 200 witnesses, her window to keep it buried closed. Which means your window to find it first is, he stopped. It's tonight. It has to be tonight. Before she moves. Sienna stood with that for a moment. The corridor was cold and smelled of dampstone as it always did, familiar and diminished in a way it hadn't been before this evening. "All right," she said. He released her arm. Something in him settled slightly, not relief exactly, but the reduction of immediate dread. "I'll be in the East Archive room if you need me. I want to look at something." He was already moving. He paused once, looked back. "Sienna. Whatever it says, you've been ready for it for longer than you think." Then he was gone around the corner, and she was alone in the corridor, and the night was waiting. The coat was on the hook where she'd left it. The room was exactly as she'd left it. Everything was the same and nothing was the same, and Sienna stood just inside the closed door for a moment with her back to the coat and her eyes on the far wall and breathed until her hands stopped doing what they were doing. They were shaking. Not from cold. Not from exhaustion. Her grandmother had had a name for this, the trembling before truth, she'd called it, on the night she pressed the letter into Sienna's hands. When your hands know what your mind hasn't caught up to yet. She turned around. She took the coat off the hook. She sat on the edge of the bed with it across her knees, and she found the seam by feel, the stiffened section of lining, the faint angular shape of the folded paper inside. 3 years she had felt it there without opening it. 3 years of carrying the weight of an unknown thing, because unknown felt survivable in a way that certain things sometimes didn't. She broke the seal. The paper was old, the kind that had been written on with intention and then protected carefully against time. Her grandmother's handwriting covered both sides, small, precise, deeply familiar. Sienna read slowly, because some things asked to be read slowly, and because her hands were still shaking and she needed to. The first passage was genealogy. Dry and precise, names and dates going back 8 generations, a bloodline recorded in the formal notation of pack law. She read the name at the top of the lineage once, and then again, and then a third time, because the first 2 times her mind had simply moved past it without processing what it meant. Ashveil. The founding line. The bloodline that appeared in the preamble of nearly every major pack covenant on the continent, not as a participant in the founding, but as the origin of it. The first pack. The line from which the coalition structure itself had been drawn, centuries before the Ironveil coalition existed, before Summit Forge existed, before the territories had their current names. The legal architecture of the entire pack world was built on the covenant that the Ashveil bloodline had authored and sealed. And she was the last of it. The letter laid that out with the precision of a legal document, because that was exactly what it was, a witnessed record, signed by 3 pack elders who had apparently spent years ensuring its accuracy and safety. The Ashveil line had not died. It had been hidden, deliberately, by her grandmother, when hiding had been the only way to protect what remained. Sienna's classification as Omega was not a finding. It was a fabrication built on an absence of records, because her grandmother had removed the records. She had not been lost. She had been kept. The final paragraph was different from the rest, shorter, written in a hand that was slightly less steady than the formal sections, as if it had been added last and in a different state of mind. Her grandmother's voice, not the legal voice, the real one. You were never hidden, my love. You were kept safe until the world was ready for you. The covenant does not forget its bloodline. Neither does the land. Go find out what your name means, and then decide what to do with it. That has always been yours to choose. Sienna sat with it for a long time. The candle burned down. She didn't move to replace it. She sat in the narrowing light with the letter open across her knees, and she thought about 3 years of marble corridors she wasn't allowed to use and cold water and a cup of tea tipped onto a clean floor. And she thought about the founding covenant she had read aloud tonight with words that had felt like memory, and she thought about a man's hand closing around her wrist as if it had been waiting to do exactly that. In the guest quarters on the east side of the estate, Reed Wilder stood at the window with his arms crossed and said nothing for a long time. His aide, a quiet wolf named Caro who had been with him for 6 years and knew better than to fill his silences, waited. The regional summit 2 years ago had been a 3-day gathering of pack leaders from across the continent, routine, procedural, the kind of event Reed attended because his position required it and endured because it rarely produced anything worth the travel. Except that on the second morning, walking between the eastern pavilions, he had caught a scent. Wild grass and something older underneath it, the particular warm resonance of an ancient bloodline the way you catch wood smoke, unmistakably itself, impossible to misidentify. His wolf had come awake in an instant, fully, completely, in a way it hadn't in years. By the time he turned to follow it, it was gone. He'd spent the rest of that summit methodically working through every wolf present, and found nothing. He'd gone back over the attendee records 3 times in the following months. He'd mentioned it to no one, because there were no words for it that didn't sound like instability, and an alpha of the Ironveil coalition could not afford to sound unstable. But his wolf had been restless ever since, in the specific way of an animal that has caught a trail and been pulled off it before reaching the end, and no amount of time or distance had fully settled it. He had come to Summit Forge's founder's ceremony because Callum vossoed him a conversation about territorial boundaries, and for no other reason. He had arrived late and stood in the back because he hadn't wanted ceremony. He had watched a woman in servant's clothes climb a stage and read from the Ashveil founding covenant in a voice that carried the text as if she'd been born knowing it, and his wolf had gone absolutely silent, not dormant, but still in the way of an animal that has stopped moving because it has found what it was tracking. And then they pushed her off the stage. "Caro," he said. "Your Grace. I found my mate tonight." A pause. "Congratulations, your..." She was mopping floors. The words came out level, measured, with a quietness underneath them that was the most controlled expression of fury Caro had ever heard from anyone. "She has been mopping floors in this estate for 3 years. Caro said nothing. Reed turned from the window. "I want everything you can find on Summit Forge's Omega classification records. Tonight." She was sitting on the floor of the small staircase behind the linen room, her staircase, the one that smelled of damp stone, with the letter folded on her knees when she heard the footstep. She was on her feet immediately, back against the wall, and then she recognized the quality of the silence that came with it and made herself stop. Reed came around the corner without hurry and without pretense. He took in the scene, the letter, her position, the hour, and did not comment on any of it. He looked around for somewhere to sit, found the third step and sat on it, which put him below eye level with her. She wasn't sure if that was deliberate. She suspected it was. "I'm not here to press you," he said. "I want to know what you know. That's all." She studied him for a moment. In the dim light of the corridor, stripped of the ceremony's grandeur, he was simply a man sitting on a stone step at an unreasonable hour because something had mattered enough to bring him here. She made a decision. She told him about the letter. Not everything, not the last paragraph, not her grandmother's voice, those parts were hers, but the substance of it. The bloodline. The Ashveil covenant. The legal weight of what her name apparently carried. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I suspected something," he said. "The way you read tonight. The founding covenant isn't casual language. Most people with formal training still stumble through it. You read it like it was already yours." She didn't answer that. The scent confirmed it, he added, and she heard the weight of something longer in those 3 words, a story she wasn't getting all of tonight. Then he looked at her directly. "What do you want to do?" She blinked. Of all the things she had been prepared for him to say, of all the questions she had anticipated, claims, strategies, declarations, the machinery of powerful people making decisions on behalf of other people, she had not prepared for that one. It arrived like a hand offered when you had long since stopped expecting anyone to extend one. "No one's asked me that in 3 years," she said, before she could decide not to. He held her gaze. "I'm asking now." Act 4. The Unraveling. Luca was not a brave man by nature. He knew this about himself the way you know the things that are simply true, without judgment, without particular shame. He had spent most of his life making careful, sensible decisions, staying inside the lines of his rank, keeping his head at the height the system expected it. He had exactly one ongoing act of defiance to his name, and it was a friendship with an Omega that he'd maintained by keeping it quiet and small and deniable. What he did over the 3 nights following the founder's ceremony was not careful or sensible, and it could not be kept quiet forever. He understood that going in. He went in anyway. The sealed archives occupied a room off the lower administrative corridor, locked with a key that the estate secretary kept on a ring at his belt. Luca had spent 6 months as an administrative runner 4 years ago, before his rank reclassification. He knew where the spare was kept. He had never used that knowledge for anything, because until now there had been nothing that required it. The first night, he pulled financial records. Estate disbursements going back 4 years, looking for anything that felt irregular: payments to contractors not listed in the official register, invoices without clear service descriptions. He found it on the third ledger, tucked between building maintenance expenses and a catering payment for a mid-year council dinner. A single line: genealogical consultation services, paid from Tessa Noir's personal household account rather than the estate general fund. The payee was a name Luca didn't recognize. The date was 11 weeks after Sienna had arrived. He wrote it down and kept going. The second night, he found the bloodline registry. Summit Forge maintained records of every wolf who had passed through its gates, intake classifications, bloodline documentation where available, rank assignments. Sienna's entry was there, 3 years old, filed under Omega with a notation of no verifiable lineage. Standard enough, except that when Luca held the page at an angle to the candle, he could see it faint, but present. The ghost of ink beneath ink. Someone had written something in that lineage field, and then obscured it, carefully, with a slightly different shade that had dried to near invisibility unless the light hit it just right. He stared at that page for a long time. Then he turned to the next. The third night, he found the letter. It was filed, of all places, inside a property survey for the northeastern border territory, the kind of document no one would pull without a specific reason, buried in a folder that hadn't been accessed in over a year according to the sign-out log. 2 pages, written in Tessa's handwriting, addressed to Gage Thorne. The language was careful, the way careful people write when they understand that written words are evidence, but write them anyway because they trust their own control of the situation completely. It discussed the problem of the Ashveil girl. It used that phrase 3 times. It outlined the necessity of ensuring she remains beneath notice indefinitely and referenced an arrangement already in place regarding her classification. It thanked Thorne for his patience and assured him that the territorial matter they had discussed would proceed without complication once the problem was resolved. Luca sat with that page in his hands until the candle burned low. Then he folded everything carefully, put it inside his jacket, relocked the archive room, and went to find Sienna. She was in the kitchen courtyard, the one place at this hour where a person could sit outside without explanation, and she was already awake, which told him she had not been sleeping well either. He sat across from her on the low stone bench and put the documents on the surface between them without preamble, because there was no gentle approach to what these pages contained. She read everything. He watched her face while she did. The genealogist's invoice first. She took that in without visible reaction, just a slight tightening around the eyes. The registry page, where he pointed out the shadow of the obscured ink. She held it at the angle he showed her and went still for a moment. Then the letter. She read it twice. He knew she read it twice because he was watching the movement of her eyes, and she went back to the top after the first pass without looking up. When she set it down, the courtyard was very quiet. This was not how Sienna cried or raged. He had been watching her long enough to know that she didn't, that both of those things required a kind of available feeling that years of survival had pushed somewhere unreachable. What she did instead was go quiet in a specific way, a settling, a deepening stillness, like water that has been disturbed and is returning to its level. The level was lower now. The surface was perfectly, completely calm. He let the silence run its full length before he spoke. Tessa knew within 3 months of you arriving. The genealogist, I tracked the name. He's based in the Southern Territories, does private consultation work for noble families. What he was paid for, given the timing and the registry entry, was falsification. He kept his voice flat and factual because that was what the moment needed. Gage Thorne has been trying to absorb Summit Forge's northeastern border territory for 2 years. The Ashveil Covenant includes a provision that the founding bloodline carries veto authority over territorial transfers. If you exist and are recognized, his claim fails. It fails completely and permanently. Sienna looked at the letter again. They built it, she said. Her voice was even. All of it. The rank, the classification, all of it was built. Yes. The floor scrubbing. The cold water. Dax Rourke in every corridor I needed to use. The tea. She paused on that one. She poured that tea because she was afraid of me. Luca held her gaze. She poured that tea because she needed to believe she still could. Something moved through Sienna's expression then, not anger, not grief, something with more structure than either of those. A decision forming, visible only because he had been watching her face for 3 years and knew the difference between Sienna enduring something and Sienna deciding something. He was watching the second thing happen in real time. "What does Reed know?" she asked. "I haven't told him anything. This is yours first." She nodded. She picked up the documents and folded them into her coat, the one that had carried the letter, with the care of someone handling material they are going to need to produce intact. Then she stood. Tessa moved the morning after, which meant she had been watching the corridors and had seen Luca leave the archive room, or she had her own sources, or she had simply understood after the founder's ceremony that the window was narrow and decided not to wait for it to close on her. She requested an emergency session of the Pack Council before most of the estate had finished breakfast. By mid-morning, the council chamber was convened. Sienna heard about it from a kitchen wolf who had heard it from a ranked guard who had been posted to the chamber door. The formal subject on the record was Pack security and external interference. The informal subject, delivered in Tessa's precise, unhurried voice to a room full of council members who trusted her implicitly and had very little reason not to, was Sienna. She had fabricated a bloodline claim, Tessa told them. She had used a forged document to position herself near a visiting alpha of significant power. Her intention was destabilization, the kind of targeted manipulation that foreign interests occasionally attempted against established packs from the inside, using vulnerable individuals as instruments. It was a serious matter. It required immediate response. Marcus Hale, sitting at the head of the table, looked deeply uncomfortable in the way of a man who wanted very much to be on the right side of something, but wasn't yet certain which side that was. The council members around him looked to him, and then to Tessa, and then to each other, performing the social calculus of rooms where power is being contested and no one wants to be caught backing the wrong position. In the gallery, Gage Thorne sat with his hands folded and his expression composed. The patience of a man who had built something carefully and was watching it either hold or collapse, and had decided that watching was all he could afford to do right now. Tessa was fluent, and she was confident, and she had survived everything Summit Forge had thrown at her for a decade by being exactly this: unshakable, credible, the most authoritative voice in any room she entered. She had survived worse than a servant girl with a letter, and her bearing said so without saying it. Reed found Sienna in the East Corridor, which was either coincidence or he had also been listening to the estate's information channels, and she suspected the latter. He was brief. "I can end this before it goes further," he said. "One statement from me to the council invokes coalition jurisdiction. Tessa's accusation becomes moot. The chamber disbands and we handle this through proper bloodline protocols." He paused. It would take approximately 4 minutes. She looked at him. He looked back at her without pressure, which she was beginning to understand was one of the most deliberate things about him. The absence of pressure, in a man who could apply an enormous amount of it. "No," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, reading her, not challenging her. Then he nodded once, a single clean acknowledgement. "Then I'll be there," he said. "But it's yours." She turned toward the council chamber. Behind her, she heard him fall into step at a distance that was close enough to matter and far enough to mean what he'd said. Act 5. The Reckoning. The council chamber was the oldest room in Summit Forge's estate, and it looked it. Dark timber beams, stone walls that had absorbed 3 centuries of difficult conversations, a long table of age-blackened oak that had never once been replaced, because replacing it would have meant admitting that time passed even here. The chairs along the walls were for elders and senior nobles. The gallery above held overflow, and it was full today in a way it rarely was for emergency sessions, because word had moved through the estate the way water moves through old stone, finding every crack, reaching every level. Marcus Hale sat at the head of the table in the chair that was slightly larger than the others, because that was how you knew it was his. He had the look of a man who had woken up that morning expecting a routine day and was now sitting inside something he couldn't yet measure. His hands were flat on the table, very still, in the way of people who are being careful with their own body language. The council members ranged along both sides, 7 of them, pack elders and senior-ranked wolves, all of whom had served Summit Forge long enough to know that emergency sessions called by the Luna were not routine and required the full performance of attentiveness. They were performing it now, faces arranged in expressions of grave consideration, though several of them kept glancing toward the back of the room where Reed Wilder stood against the wall with his arms at his sides and said nothing. Along the far wall, the standing witnesses, nobles, senior staff, 2 visiting dignitaries who had no official reason to be here and were here anyway. And in the doorways, which were technically closed but had developed an inexplicable gap on both sides, the faces of people who were never meant to be in rooms like this one. Kitchen wolves. Housekeeping staff. A laundress Sienna recognized by her red hands. They stood in the threshold of a room that had never acknowledged their existence and watched with the focused attention of people for whom the outcome of this session was not abstract. Dax Rourke was near the back corner, arms crossed, with the expression of a man who had begun doing arithmetic and did not like the sums he was reaching. In the gallery, Gage Thorne sat with his hands folded and his border wolf stillness fully deployed. And at the center of it all, standing with her back straight and her dark clothing immaculate and her face composed into the expression of a woman who has never once in her life doubted her right to occupy whatever room she was standing in, was Tessa Noir. Sienna walked in through the main door. She was still in servant's clothes. She had considered, briefly, changing them and then decided against it, not out of resignation but out of precision. She wanted the room to see exactly what it was looking at. The bruise at her wrist where she had caught herself after the fall was visible above her cuff, faint yellow-green at the edges now, the kind of mark that announced itself quietly. She walked to the center of the room and stopped, and she did not look at Marcus Hale or the council or the doorways full of watching faces. She looked at Tessa. Tessa looked back at her with an expression of calm concern, which was the most expensive thing she owned. Tessa spoke first, because she had called the session, and it was her room, and she understood the advantage of framing. She was a gifted speaker. Sienna had always known this in the abstract, from a distance, had heard her address the pack at formal gatherings, had understood from the way rooms responded to her voice that it was a honed instrument. Watching it deployed at close range, aimed directly at her, was a different experience. Tessa did not shout. She did not perform outrage. She laid it out with the measured gravity of a woman reluctantly sharing something that troubled her deeply and that she wished very much were not true. She spoke of Sienna's arrival 3 years ago, no references, no verifiable history, a story that had never fully cohered on examination. She spoke of the founder's ceremony, her voice carrying just the right weight of sorrow, the disruption of a sacred tradition, the opportunistic timing of an unannounced visitor with significant political power. She used the phrase disturbing pattern twice, and both times the council registered it. The forgery, she said, was sophisticated. She did not know who had helped produce it. She suspected resources beyond Summit Forge's borders, which was itself a concerning implication she would leave the council to consider. What was not in doubt was the intent, to introduce a fraudulent claim into a moment of maximum visibility, to attach it to a powerful alpha through manufactured proximity, and to use that attachment to destabilize an established pack for purposes that remained opaque but were certainly not benign. She paused there, letting the architecture of it settle. Several council members were nodding. Marcus Hale was nodding slowly, with the particular rhythm of a man being persuaded against a competing instinct. One of the elders had his hands folded and his eyes on Sienna with an expression that was not yet hostile, but was preparing for the option. At the back of the room, Reed watched Sienna. Only Sienna. His face was unreadable in the way of someone who has decided that whatever he feels about what he is currently witnessing will be dealt with later, when the room is no longer watching. Tessa concluded with an expression of regret so fluent it could have been genuine. The pack's integrity, she said, was not something she would apologize for protecting. Whatever this young woman's circumstances, whatever hardship had led her to this choice, the answer was not to allow a fabricated bloodline claim to stand unchallenged at the heart of Summit Forge. She stepped back. The room exhaled. Sienna reached into her coat and set the letter on the table. She did it without preamble, without a responding speech, without any of the language of accusation or defense. She placed it on the oak surface, centered, and then she stepped back. Luca came forward from the far wall. He was pale, she could see it from where she stood, with the specific pallor of someone whose body is registering fear that their mind has decided to override. His hands were not entirely steady. He placed the documents beside the letter in sequence, each one separated from the last with deliberate spacing, as if he understood that the room needed to receive them individually. The genealogist's invoice first. He did not explain it. He set it down. The bloodline registry page next, open to the entry, and he held it at the angle that caught the light from the high window, the angle that made the obscured ink visible beneath the covering ink, the ghost of a name written and then buried. He held it long enough for the nearest council members to see it, then set it flat on the table. Then the letter. Tessa's handwriting. The salutation to Gage Thorne. 3 pages unfolded. He stepped back. The room read. Marcus Hale reached for the letter first, because it was closest to him, and because he was the kind of man whose instinct in an uncertain situation was to gather information before committing to a position. He read the first page. Then the second. His hands, flat and still at the start of the session, had developed a faint tremor by the third. The elder on his left leaned in to read alongside him. Then the council member across the table reached forward and took the registry page and held it to the light, and the person beside him leaned in to look, and the chain of comprehension moved around the table in a slow, irreversible wave. The silence that followed was different from every other silence the room had held. It had density. It had direction. It was the silence of a verdict forming before anyone had spoken it aloud. Tessa felt the shift before she could name it, that particular alteration in a room's attention when it is no longer moving toward you. She had felt it once or twice in a long career of managing rooms, and she had always responded to it the same way: pivot, reframe, attack the foundation of the thing threatening you before it can stand fully upright. She questioned Luca first, with the crisp authority of someone who has not yet admitted to themselves that the ground is moving. His rank, his access, his motivations, she named them as disqualifying factors with the confidence of a woman who still believed confidence was the variable that mattered most. The documents, she said, could have come from anywhere. Could have been altered. The archives were sealed for reasons, and the fact that an Omega and a mid-rank wolf with a personal attachment had accessed them outside proper channels was itself a violation that ought to redirect the council's attention. She was still good. Even now, she was still good. But the room had read the letter in her own handwriting discussing the problem of the Ashveil girl, and the council members who had been nodding were now very still and not making eye contact with her, which was a different kind of verdict. In the gallery, Gage Thorne unfolded his hands. He stood, a careful movement, and turned with the unhurried bearing of a man who has simply decided to step out for air. One of Reed's men was already at the gallery door. He had been there since the session began, stationed with the easy stillness of someone following instructions given in advance. Thorne looked at him. The man did not move. Thorne sat back down. His hands, when he refolded them, were not entirely steady. Dax Rourke, in the back corner, had stopped doing arithmetic and arrived at the sum. His arms were no longer crossed. He was very interested in the floor. Tessa was still speaking when Reed stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room gave him its attention the way rooms do for people who carry absolute authority without performing it, immediately, completely, with no resistance. He named his full title. Alpha of the Ashveil Coalition, primary signatory of the Continental Pact Accords, holding jurisdictional authority in bloodline disputes involving legacy pacts under the Founding Covenant. He said it the way you recite a legal fact, not for effect, but for the record. Every elder in the room knew what it meant. Coalition jurisdiction was final. There was no body above it to appeal to. Then he addressed the chamber with the brevity of someone who understands that a verdict does not require elaboration. Luna Tessa Noir, he said, would be removed from her position pending formal tribunal. The evidence on the table constituted sufficient grounds to proceed. Gage Thorne's northeastern territorial claims, contingent as they were on the suppression of an active Ashveil bloodline, were voided effective immediately and would not be reinstated under any subsequent filing. Pack enforcer Dax Rourke would present himself to the tribunal on a secondary charge of willful participation. Marcus Hale and the council would remain in place to manage the transition. 16 words delivered across perhaps 40 seconds. Not a single word above conversational volume. Every one of them landing like dropped stone. Marcus Hale had stopped nodding. He was sitting very straight and looking at the table with the expression of a man taking his own measure and finding it necessary to make some adjustments. Then Reed turned. He turned away from the council table, away from the elders and the nobles and the doorways full of watching eyes, and he faced Sienna. And he went to one knee. The room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with shock. Shock is sudden and unstable. This was something else, the silence of something enormous arriving that everyone present understood would not be undone. It settled over the chamber like a change in pressure, like the moment before a storm breaks when the air itself seems to pause and take stock. He did not reach for her hand. He did not perform it. He simply knelt at the center of the oldest room in Summit Forge, in front of every witness the estate had to offer. And he looked up at her with the directness of a man who has been searching for something for 2 years and has finally stopped pretending he is at peace with anything less. He asked, not claimed, not declared. He asked, every word chosen, unhurried, with the full weight of what they both knew underneath them, whether she would accept the bond, the title, the life that came with both. Whether she would stand beside him. Whether she would let this be what it was. Sienna stood with it for a moment. 3 years of cold water and gray corridors and a name used by no one. 3 years of a letter she was too afraid to open because she was too afraid of what it meant to be something in a world that had decided she was nothing. 3 years of making herself smaller than she was so that she might survive to be herself another day. She stood a little straighter. Not performance, reflex, the body remembering something the years had tried to train out of it. Her chin came up. Her shoulders found the line they had always been meant to carry. Somewhere in her, something that had been waiting a very long time recognized that this was it. The right time her grandmother had told her she would know. She answered. Act 6, what comes after? The consequences landed in order, which was its own kind of justice. Tessa was removed from her position before the council session had fully adjourned. There was no dramatic exit, no final speech. Reed's jurisdiction left no procedural space for either. 2 coalition guards accompanied her from the chamber with the courteous firmness of people following precise instructions, and she went with her composure intact because it was the only thing left that still belonged entirely to her. The estate watched her go in silence. Not the cruel silence of satisfaction, just the particular quiet of a community that has been holding its breath for a long time and is only now beginning to exhale. Gage Thorne was escorted from Summit Forge territory this same afternoon with a coalition detail of 4 and a document formally voiding every territorial claim he had filed or intended to file against Summit Forge's northeastern border. He was given a clear and specific account of what the Ironveil Coalition's response would be if any version of those claims resurfaced under any name or arrangement. He did not argue. He had run the arithmetic and arrived at the only sum that made sense, which was that he had lost, cleanly and completely, and that the path forward was to absorb that fact and reduce his profile considerably. He left without looking back. Dax Rourke presented himself to tribunal 3 days later. He did not do this voluntarily. The coalition's subpoena mechanism left him no alternative, and he arrived with the expression of a man who has decided that cooperation is the only remaining variable he can control. The tribunal was not swift. These things were not meant to be swift, because swift often meant incomplete, but its direction was not in question. Marcus Hale remained in place, as Reed had said he would. He accepted this without argument, which was both the least and the most he could do. In the weeks that followed, he was a different kind of presence in the estate's daily proceedings, quieter, more careful, the particular attentiveness of a man who has learned the specific cost of looking away. He was not a villain. He had simply been a bystander at a very long crime, and now he would spend however many years remained to him being something better than that. Whether he managed it was between him and whatever measure he used for himself. Sienna did not watch any of it with satisfaction, exactly. Satisfaction implied she had wanted this, had been waiting for the fall of specific people. What she had wanted was simpler and older than that, to exist without architecture built around her designed to prevent it. The consequences were not the point. The space they cleared was. The servants knew before the official announcement. Word below stairs moved differently than word above it, faster, more accurate, stripped of the performance that ranked communication required. By the morning after the council session, the kitchen, the laundry room, the housekeeping corridors, all of it knew. They came to her in ones and twos, not in a group, because this was not a collective moment. It was a series of private ones. The cook, a broad woman named Elsa who had managed the Summit Forge kitchen for 11 years and who had given Sienna the smallest portions at every meal without ever appearing to notice she was doing it, she came first. She stood in the east corridor where Sienna was standing with nowhere particular to be, which was a new sensation, and she looked at her for a long moment. She didn't apologize. Sienna would have found apology insufficient in a way she couldn't have articulated, and Elsa seemed to understand this without being told. What she said instead was, "I always gave you the bread that was going stale first." A pause. "I don't know why I'm saying that." Another pause. "I suppose I want you to know that I know." Sienna looked at her. "I know that you know," she said. "That's enough." The laundress came later, the one with the red hands who had never returned Sienna's nod in 3 years of passing in corridors. She didn't speak at all. She just nodded fully, deliberately, holding eye contact, and walked on. It was the same nod Sienna had been offering for 3 years. Returned, finally, at the correct exchange rate. The others came in their own time and their own ways. Some with words, some without. What they carried, unanimously, was not what Sienna had expected. She had anticipated guilt, or the performance of guilt, or the awkwardness of people who have behaved badly and need to manage their own discomfort about it. What she found instead was something quieter and more genuine, a kind of retrospective recognition. They had known, most of them, that she was different, not in the ranked wolf sense, but in the human sense. That she worked without complaint and didn't hoard the warmth near the furnace on cold mornings and always listened when someone needed to talk and never, in 3 years, treated any of them as less than what they were. They had filed this away without a category for it. Now they had one. The woman who had mopped floors beside them was their rightful heir, and they did not feel deceived by that. They felt, in a way that surprised several of them considerably, honored. She found Luca in the herb garden off the kitchen courtyard, which was where he went when he needed quiet, which she knew because she had spent 3 years learning the geography of people she trusted, and the list had been very short. She sat beside him on the low wall. Neither of them spoke for a while, which was comfortable in the way that silences are comfortable between people who have never needed to fill them. "I keep thinking about the archive room," he said eventually. "The second night, around 2 in the morning, I was certain I'd left the ledger facing the wrong direction, and someone would know. I kept staring at it." "Did you fix it?" "Twice. It probably made it worse." He looked at his hands. "I've never done anything like that in my life." "I know. I'd do it again," he said, not as a declaration, just as a fact he was noting aloud for accuracy. "I know that too." She looked at the garden, the winter herbs in their careful rows, the stone wall beyond. "I'm going to need people I trust. In whatever comes next. The coalition work, the Ashveil covenant, what that means for the territories, all of it." She paused. "I have a very short list." Luca was quiet for a moment. "Then, you have somewhere to be this afternoon, so I'll keep this brief." He stood up, brushed the dust off his jacket with the precise movements of a man who has already made his decision and is simply completing the physical transaction of the moment. "My answer is yes. Obviously." She looked up at him. He looked back at her with the straightforward decency that had been the single constant of 3 difficult years, and she understood, not for the first time, but perhaps most clearly in this moment, that some people's goodness was not heroic. It was simply persistent. And persistence, in the end, was what had mattered. Reed taught her in the mornings, before the estate's official day began, in the training ground behind the east wing that had always been locked to her. He understood from the beginning that she was not starting from nothing, which was the most useful thing he could have understood. 3 years of physical labor had given her a body that knew endurance. 3 years of navigating danger by reading rooms and people had given her instincts that formal training rarely produced in wolves who had always been safe. She was not a blank page. She was a page that had been written on in a language no one had bothered to translate for her. He translated it. The first morning, she disarmed him by accident, a reflexive movement she hadn't planned, her body responding to his angle before her mind caught up to it, and he stopped and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts assessment and something warmer. "You've been doing that your whole life," he said. "Reading threats before they fully form. You just didn't know that was a skill." "I thought it was anxiety." "It's both," he said, and reset his stance, and they went again. The training carried warmth in it, which she hadn't expected. She had expected instruction, precision, the serious business of building someone's capability. And it was that. But it was also the particular humor of 2 people discovering each other in the small moments, his patience when she was frustrated, her refusal to accept his corrections until he could explain the reasoning behind them. The morning she finally managed the shift in under 4 seconds, and he said, without inflection, "About time," and she threw a practice pad at his head, and he caught it without looking. Her wolf came easier now. Weeks of training and the settled certainty of the mate bond had loosened something that had been rigid with years of suppression. The shift stopped feeling like a negotiation and started feeling like a choice. Gold fur, green eyes, the particular compact power of a she-wolf who had spent 3 years with nowhere to put her strength and was only now learning all the places it could go. The first night they ran together, it was not planned. They were at the edge of the estate grounds after a late training session, the sky already dark and the territory open beyond the wall, and she shifted without deciding to. The wolf simply stepping forward, because the night was there and the territory was hers now, and there were no corridors left that she wasn't allowed to use. He shifted beside her without a word. They ran. Through the tree line and into the open territory beyond, across ground that the Ashveil covenant had named and her grandmother's letter had waited to give back to her. Gold fur and dark, moving in the moonlight across land that would not forget them. No destination, no route mapped in advance, just forward, because forward was available now, and available was something she intended never to take for granted again. She didn't win by becoming someone else. She won by finally being allowed to be who she always was.